I gave him one chance to fix it. He looked me in the eye and said no. So I did the only thing left. I bought 2 tickets, one way, and I told no one where we were going. Not my mother, not my best friend, not even the person I was bringing with me. I packed a single suitcase, folded 14 years of marriage into the corners of it, and left the ring on the kitchen counter next to a note he wouldn't read until it was already too late to matter. What I found waiting for me on that plane wasn't freedom. It wasn't relief. It was something I never saw coming, something that would make everything before it look small by comparison. And by the time we land in this story together, you will understand why the leaving was never the twist. The twist was what came after. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. There are 3 questions sitting at the center of what I'm about to tell you, and I want you to hold on to all 3 of them as this story unfolds, because the answers do not arrive in the order you expect. The first question is simple. What did my husband refuse to take back, even when he understood he might lose his family over it? The second question is harder. Where those 2 tickets were actually going, and why the answer had nothing to do with running away. And the third question is the one that took me the longest to answer myself. Who was really supposed to be sitting in that second seat beside me? Because it was not who you think. And by the time you find out, you will understand why I could not tell anyone, not even the people closest to me, what I already knew. My name is Claire Whitman, and for 14 years I built a life with a man everyone called Rick. A man I met in a college library on a Tuesday night neither of us can remember clearly anymore because we were both too busy pretending we weren't paying attention to each other. He was studying business finance 3 tables away, and I was supposed to be reading for a literature exam I ended up failing because I spent the whole night finding reasons to walk past his table. We were married 4 years later, 23 years old, broke in the particular way only 2 people fresh out of college can be broke, splitting a 1-bedroom apartment with a mattress on the floor and a card table we found abandoned on a curb 3 blocks from campus. We used that card table for everything. We ate dinner on it. We filled out our first joint tax return on it. And one night, after a diner dinner we could barely afford, we sketched the outline of a consulting business on the back of a paper placemat, half joking, half serious. The way you are when you are young enough to believe seriousness and joy can exist in the same sentence. Neither of us expected that placemat sketch to become anything real. Within 3 years, it had become our entire life. The early years of Whitman Consulting were harder than either of us admitted to anyone outside our marriage. There were months we could not pay ourselves a full salary. Rick took a second job stocking shelves overnight at a grocery store so that I could spend my days meeting with clients who were still deciding whether to trust 2 26-year-olds with their business. I remember him coming home at 5 in the morning, smelling like cardboard and cold air, sliding into bed for 2 hours before waking up to answer client emails in a collared shirt he'd ironed the night before. We were a team in the truest sense of that word. The kind of team where neither person keeps score, because keeping score would have meant admitting how uneven the sacrifice sometimes felt. By the time Ben was born, 6 years into the marriage, the business had grown into something we were genuinely proud of. a small but respected consulting firm with a handful of loyal clients and a reputation neither of us took for granted. Ben has his father's stubbornness and my patience, which some days feels like a very unfair trade. But watching Rick hold him for the first time in that hospital room is still, to this day, one of the only memories from that period I can revisit without wanting to look away. We were happy. I want to be clear about that, because I think it matters for what comes later. We were not a couple already cracking beneath the surface, quietly waiting for an excuse to fall apart. We were, by every measure I understood at the time, doing well. The cracks did not arrive all at once. They never do. They arrived the way water arrives in a basement you haven't checked in months, quietly, along the edges, in places you don't think to look until the damage is already done. It started small enough that I barely registered it as a pattern. Rick began staying later at the office we shared, the one above the coffee shop on Delancey Street that used to smell like victory to me, and slowly started smelling like something else entirely. His phone, which used to sit face up on the nightstand without a second thought, began finding its way into his pocket during dinner, into his jacket during the night, into places where my hand would have to go looking for it if I ever let myself become the kind of wife who went looking. For a long time, I told myself I wasn't that kind of wife. I told myself a lot of things that year. The woman's name was Marissa Todd, and I want to be honest with you about something before we go any further into this story. I liked her. I brought her into the business myself 2 years earlier, sat across from her at that same card table we had long since upgraded from, and told her I saw something in her that reminded me of myself at 26, hungry and sharp and unwilling to be told no. I mentored her personally. I introduced her to clients who trusted my name enough to extend that trust to hers. I invited her to our home for dinner, watched her play board games with Ben on our living room floor, and felt, for a while, like I had done something generous and good. It is a strange kind of grief, watching generosity curdle into something you can no longer look at directly. There is a particular memory that stayed with me longer than it should have. A dinner party we hosted for the whole staff that spring, 6 months before any of this came apart. Marissa brought a bottle of wine she knew was my favorite, sat beside Ben, and helped him with a puzzle he had been struggling with for weeks, and thanked me twice for everything I had taught her that year. I remember standing in the kitchen afterward, drying dishes, telling Rick how lucky we were to have found someone we could trust that completely with the business we had spent a decade building. He agreed with me. I have thought about that agreement many times since, wondering how much of it was already a performance by then, and how much of it was still, in that moment, true. A few months after that dinner, the business held its annual client gala at a hotel downtown, the kind of event where everyone wears their best version of themselves for 3 hours and calls it networking. I remember watching Marissa laugh at something Rick said near the bar, her hand resting on his arm, just a half-second longer than the joke seemed to require. I noticed it. I did not say anything. I told myself I was being the kind of paranoid wife I had promised myself I would never become, and I went back to my own conversation with a client's spouse, and I did not think about it again for almost 2 weeks. It is strange, looking back, how many small moments like that one I filed away without examining. The way you step over a crack in the sidewalk without ever really registering that the sidewalk is breaking apart beneath you. The first thing that broke my certainty completely was small enough that I almost let it go as well. A hotel receipt, folded into the inside pocket of a jacket I was taking to the dry cleaner. Dated a weekend Rick had told me he spent alone at a conference 2 states away. I stood in our bedroom holding that piece of paper for what felt like an hour, turning it over as though the other side might explain itself differently than the first. It didn't prove anything on its own. A receipt is not a confession, but it changed the questions I was asking myself at night. And once those questions start, there is no version of you that goes back to not asking them. I did not confront him right away. I want you to understand that about me, because it matters for everything that comes later in this story. I am not a woman who explodes. I am a woman who investigates quietly, who gathers before she speaks, who would rather understand the whole shape of something before she reacts to any single piece of it. So I watched. Over the following weeks, I noticed joint credit card charges for a trip Rick called client travel that no client ever seemed to mention when I spoke with them directly. I noticed a business account I had never been asked to sign for, one that moved money in patterns that made no sense for a consulting firm our size. Small transfers, oddly timed, always just beneath the threshold, that would normally trigger a closer look from our bookkeeper. I called my brother Frank, a retired detective who spent 20 years learning to read exactly this kind of quiet wrongness, and I asked him, carefully, to help me understand what I was looking at. Frank came over on a Sunday afternoon while Rick was supposedly at the office catching up on a proposal. He sat at our kitchen table, the same one we had eaten dinner at with Marissa only months earlier, and went through every document I had gathered with the same patient thoroughness he once used interviewing witnesses. He asked questions I had not thought to ask myself. Who had access to that account? When exactly it was opened? Whether any of the transfers lined up with dates I already knew Rick had claimed to be traveling for work. By the time he finished, the kitchen had gone dark around us, and neither of us had bothered to turn on a light, as if some part of both of us understood that what we were circling did not belong in bright rooms. Frank told me something that weekend that I have not been able to shake since. He said the pattern I was describing did not look like an affair trying to hide itself. It looked like something built to survive being found. Those two things are not the same, and the difference between them is the entire reason this story does not end where you think it will. An affair wants secrecy. What Frank was describing wanted structure, timing, paperwork, a place to put money where a wife with a business degree and daily access to the books would not think to look. I sat with that thought for 3 full days before I said a single word to Rick, because some truths need time to become sayable out loud. During those 3 days, I went through the motions of an ordinary life in a way that felt almost unbearable in hindsight. I packed Ben's lunch every morning. I sat across from Rick at dinner and asked about his day the way I had asked 1,000 times before. I watched him answer easily, without hesitation, in a voice that gave nothing away. And I remember thinking that a person capable of that kind of calm while hiding something this large was either far better at compartmentalizing than I had ever given him credit for, or far more comfortable with what he was doing than I wanted to believe. Neither possibility gave me any comfort at all. In those same 3 days, I quietly began pulling together everything I could find without alerting anyone at the office. I asked our bookkeeper, a longtime employee named Patricia who had worked with us for 9 years, for copies of the last 18 months of statements under the excuse of doing a personal financial review. Patricia handed them over without question, and I remember feeling a small stab of guilt using her trust that way, though it did not stop me from doing it. I spent 2 nights after Rick had fallen asleep, sitting at our dining table with a highlighter, tracing every transfer into and out of the account Frank had flagged, building a timeline on a legal pad that eventually filled 6 full pages. At one point during that research, I convinced myself the money was going somewhere far worse than an affair could explain. I found a series of transfers to an account with a name I did not recognize at all, and for nearly a full day I believed Rick might be involved in something connected to gambling debts, or worse, something that put our family in actual danger. I called Frank in a panic, and he spent an evening quietly tracing the account through channels I did not ask too many questions about. It turned out to be a decoy of sorts, an old joint account from before Ben was born that Rick had simply forgotten to close, holding almost nothing, relevant to nothing. It was a red herring that cost me a full day of fear, and I mention it because I think it says something true about what those weeks actually felt like. Every discovery either confirmed something terrible or briefly promised to explain everything away, and I could never tell in advance which one I was about to find. When I finally confronted him, I did it at our kitchen table, the same table where we had once mapped out our entire business plan on the back of a paper napkin. I laid the receipt down first, then the credit card statements, then the account records Frank had helped me trace. I did not raise my voice. I asked him one question, and I asked it plainly. I asked him if he was going to end it with Marissa, sign her fully out of the business, and tell me the truth about the account, or if I needed to start planning a different kind of life for myself and our son. He did not deny the affair. He denied that it mattered as much as I thought it did. He told me the business could not survive without her, that she was essential, that I was overreacting to something that was purely professional beneath the personal complication. I remember thinking, very clearly, that he was not choosing another woman over me. He was choosing what they had built together over what he and I had built together, and somehow that felt like the deeper betrayal. I gave him one final chance that night, the same chance I told you about at the very beginning of this story. Take it back, all of it, or lose us forever. He asked for time. Time to protect the company. Time to figure out the right way to handle Marissa's role. Time to think. I had already given him 14 years of time. I told him I understood, and I walked upstairs, and I locked the bathroom door behind me, and I opened a travel app on my phone with hands that were steadier than I expected them to be. I booked 2 seats, one way, to a city I had never told him I had any connection to at all. I did not book those tickets out of anger. I booked them because I finally understood something Rick did not seem to grasp. Some things, once said out loud, cannot be unsaid, and some choices, once made, cannot be quietly taken back. The person sitting beside me on that plane was my brother Frank. I had not brought him along for comfort, although his presence gave me more of that than I expected. I had brought him along because 3 days earlier, Sitting in my kitchen with the receipts spread across the table, he told me something that changed the entire shape of what I thought I was dealing with. He said the pattern did not look like two people hiding an affair. It looked like two people hiding something with structure, something built to survive being discovered, and he wanted to see the underlying documents himself, with professional help, before either of us said another word to Rick. We flew to meet a forensic accountant Frank had worked with years earlier, a woman named Diane Sutter, who specialized in exactly the kind of quiet financial unraveling we needed. I brought every statement I had gathered, every account number, every strange transfer that had never made sense for a consulting firm our size. Diane spent the better part of a day going through it line by line, while Frank and I sat in her office drinking coffee that had gone cold an hour earlier. Neither of us saying much, both of us waiting for a verdict we already suspected but had not yet allowed ourselves to say out loud. While we waited, Frank told me about a case from early in his career. A small business owner who spent 2 years insisting his bookkeeper would never steal from him, right up until the numbers made it impossible to believe anything else. He said people almost never want to see the fraud closest to them, not because they are foolish, but because believing it means accepting how thoroughly they were misjudged by someone they trusted completely. What Diane found was worse than an affair, and in some strange way, that realization brought me a kind of clarity I had not expected. A significant client contract, one I had helped win 3 years earlier for a mid-sized manufacturing firm, had been quietly restructured through a shell entity that funneled a growing percentage of the revenue away from the business Rick and I owned together and into an account tied almost entirely to Marissa. It had been happening for over a year. My 50% ownership of the company meant nothing if the money was never touching the company at all. The affair had given them a reason to be alone together constantly. Late nights, closed-door meetings, weekend trips explained away as client travel, and underneath all of it, the real relationship had never been romantic at its core. It was a partnership built on quietly erasing me from something I had spent a decade building. There was a detail Diane uncovered that took the twist even further than I expected. The shell entity had not been Marissa's idea originally. Diane traced its formation back nearly 2 years, to a period when the business had nearly lost its largest client over a contract dispute Rick had never fully told me about. Rick had set up the structure himself, initially as a way to quietly protect a portion of company revenue during a period when he feared the whole business might collapse. It was meant to be temporary. Marissa, once she discovered it during an internal audit she was never supposed to have access to, did not report it. She expanded it instead, slowly redirecting more of the ongoing revenue into her own name over the following year, using her closeness with Rick and eventually her relationship with him to keep him quiet about what she was doing. Rick had begun something reckless out of fear for the company we built. Marissa had turned that fear into a private fortune, and Rick, caught between protecting a secret and admitting his own failure, had said nothing for far longer than he should have. I sat with that information for a full day before I decided what to do with it, because I understood that whatever I did next could not be undone. I met with a lawyer named Harold Weiss, recommended by Diane. a careful and unhurried man who read through everything twice before he said a word. He told me the diversion, however it had started, was fraud in its current form, and I was legally entitled to move quickly to protect what remained of my stake before either Rick or Marissa realized how much I already knew. Harold walked me through exactly what an emergency filing would require, and for the first time in weeks, I found myself thinking less like a betrayed wife and more like the co-founder of a company who still had every right to protect what she had built. He asked me hard questions about timelines, about who had access to which accounts, about whether Rick had directly moved money himself or only allowed Marissa to continue moving it. I did not have every answer that day, but I had enough, and Harold told me something I have carried with me since. He said the law does not care how long you loved someone. It only cares what you can prove. I confronted Rick a second time, and this confrontation looked nothing like the first. I did not raise questions. I laid documents on the table, one after another, in the same quiet way Diane had laid them out for me, and I watched his face change with each page, especially when I reached the ones tracing the shell entity back to its original formation 2 years earlier. He did not try to claim ignorance the way I half expected him to. He told me, in a voice that cracked in a way I had not heard from him in 14 years, that he had made a panicked decision to protect the business once, years ago, and had spent every year since terrified of what would happen if I ever found out how it started, let alone what it had grown into in Marissa's hands. He said he believed he could contain it quietly, remove Marissa without exposing his own original mistake, and fix everything before it ever reached me. I asked him one final time to take it back, to end things completely, to help me undo what had been done before it became something neither of us could recover from. He asked me for more time, time to fix the business, time to protect his own name along with hers. I realized, sitting across from him, that he was still protecting the wrong thing, the same thing he had been protecting from the very beginning. I did not raise my voice when I told him my answer. I simply stood up, walked to the drawer where I kept our important documents, and pulled out the envelope Harold Weiss had prepared for me 2 days earlier. Inside it were the 2 boarding passes you saw at the very beginning of this story, along with a formal notice of intent to pursue legal action to freeze the disputed accounts and protect my ownership stake immediately. Rick asked me where I was going. I told him the truth. I was not running away from him. I was moving toward the only version of my future that still belonged entirely to me. Within 48 hours, working alongside Harold and Diane, we filed for an emergency freeze on the Shell account and formally notified the client whose contract had been quietly redirected. The client, stunned to learn how their contract had been restructured without their knowledge, cooperated fully, and their willingness to provide records made the legal process move faster than Harold had originally expected. Marissa was removed from the business by court order within the month, her access severed, her name stripped from every account she had used to funnel money away from a company she had never fully owned. She tried, briefly, to argue that Rick had authorized everything from the beginning, which was not entirely false, though the scale of what she personally redirected went far beyond anything Rick had ever intended or controlled. Rick was left holding a business that could no longer function without the 2 people who had actually made it work. my client relationships and Marissa's operational role, both gone within the same season, along with a legal exposure of his own that Harold made clear would follow him for a long time. Ben stayed with my parents during the 2 weeks it took to finalize the legal filings, safe and unaware of just how quickly his mother had moved to protect their future. I want to tell you honestly that none of this felt like victory while it was happening. There were nights during those 2 weeks when I sat alone in a hotel room, boarding passes and legal documents spread across the bed beside me, wondering whether I had done the right thing or simply the fastest thing available to me. Frank called every evening to check on me, and Ben called too, his voice small and confused over the phone, asking when I was coming home and whether Dad was going to be there when I did. I did not have good answers for him then. I am not certain I have entirely good answers for him now. But I knew, even in those uncertain nights, that staying silent would have cost me something I was no longer willing to lose. Months later, Ben and I settled into a new apartment across town, and the business, what remained of it, was restructured under my sole ownership, with Harold's continued help. It was not the same business it had been. Some clients left when the story of the restructuring became impossible to fully contain, and I do not blame them for their caution. But enough stayed. Enough trusted the name I had spent a decade building on my own merit, and slowly, month by month, something steadier began to take shape in place of what had collapsed. Ben adjusted the way children often do, faster than the adults around them, though there were nights he asked questions I still did not know how to answer completely, questions about his father that I answered as gently and as honestly as I could manage. Rick reached out more than once during those months, asking for another conversation, another chance to explain, another opportunity to take back what he had refused to take back when it still could have saved us. I did not respond, not out of anger, but because I finally understood that some questions only need to be answered once. He had already told me everything I needed to know the night he chose more time over the truth. And again, the second time, when he chose it once more, even after everything was already laid out in front of him. I heard secondhand, through people who still moved in the same circles we once shared, that he eventually settled a portion of his own legal exposure quietly and left the city entirely, starting over somewhere far from the wreckage of a company that used to carry both our names on its door. I think about that night often, the one where I asked him to take it back or lose us forever. I used to believe I was asking him to give something up. Looking back now, I think I was really asking whether there was anything left between us worth saving at all. He answered that question without saying a single word, twice, in 2 different rooms, months apart, and it took me leaving with 2 one-way tickets to finally hear him clearly both times. If you were in my position, I wonder whether you would have booked those tickets, or whether you would have given him one more chance, the way I almost did. Tell me honestly in the comments what you would have done differently, and whether you think Rick's fear all those years ago excuses how far things eventually went, or whether a mistake protected too long simply becomes its own kind of betrayal. If this story stayed with you the way it stayed with me, there is another one waiting for you. One about a business partner who turned out to be the very last person anyone expected to betray a family from the inside, and how far she was willing to go before anyone noticed. Subscribe so you don't miss it. and I'll see you in the next one.